My parents stole $68,000. That money was supposed to pay for the surgery that could have saved my 6-year-old daughter's life. My sister looked at me with a completely blank face and said, "If it's fate, she'll survive." Then my mom added, as if it were an afterthought, "We really needed that money." I didn't scream at them. I didn't even cry. It took only 3 hours for their comfortable world to begin falling apart. Earlier that day, the hospital administrator had smiled at me like it was a perfectly normal Tuesday morning. "Just let me know whenever you're ready," she said, holding out the little machine to pay with a card. I took a breath and told myself I was ready. I slid my card into the slot. There was a quiet click, the screen flashed, and then a short beep. "I'm sorry, but the payment was declined." A laugh escaped my lips. What else are you supposed to do when your entire life shatters and the reason is spelled out for you in big letters on a tiny screen? I asked if we could try one more time. She tried again, and the result was the same. Another decline. Her professional smile became a little strained as she suggested I contact my bank. I nodded and pulled out my phone. My hands were trembling so violently I nearly dropped it on the floor. The banking application took forever to load, spinning those little blue circles endlessly as if time meant nothing. Finally, the screen opened. 0. Just a flat, green background with a number that had to be a mistake. Not a small amount missing, but completely empty. For a moment, I thought I had opened the wrong account. I logged out and signed back in, but it was still 0. Behind me, my daughter Ivy was humming softly and swinging her legs from the chair where she sat waiting. That ordinary, sweet sound cut through me like a knife. I started scrolling through the transaction history, and there they were, dozens of transfers, small amounts one after another, all of them leaving my account. My brain could not yet comprehend the total sum, but the length of the list told me everything I needed to know. The administrator gently asked if everything was all right. I answered with a voice that did not sound like my own. I told her it was just a small problem, a glitch. She hesitated for a moment and then explained that if I could make the deposit before 9 o'clock in the morning, they could hold my daughter's surgery slot. After that, it would have to be offered to the next waiting patient. I promised her I would have everything sorted out by morning and offered a fragile smile, the kind people give when they are bleeding internally, but have not yet noticed the blood on the floor. The drive home was a blur of highway lights flashing past the windows. The administrator's words kept echoing in my head. 9 o'clock in the morning. I called the bank on speakerphone while Ivy asked from the back seat if we could stop for pancakes. 10 minutes of hold music played before a tired but polite woman finally answered. She confirmed what I already feared. There had been several outgoing transfers over the previous days, and all of them were successful. When I asked if they could stop the transactions or reverse them, she told me the funds had already been credited to other accounts. The only option was to file a fraud report in the morning. I told Ivy we would make pancakes at home instead. She asked if we could put sprinkles on them, and I said of course. When we got home, I dropped my bag on the kitchen table and tried to breathe normally. The apartment smelled like laundry powder and the familiar scent of crayons. Ivy began laying out her coloring books and humming quietly to herself. She always sings when she feels safe. The problem was that I no longer knew where safety existed anymore. I opened the banking application again, and the same number stared back at me, 0. Every single penny I had saved to save my little girl was simply gone. I remembered what the surgeon had told me. If we started quickly, the prognosis would be excellent. Speed was the most important factor. I grabbed my keys and told Ivy to put on her shoes and bring her stuffed rabbit. She nodded without asking any questions, and that quiet obedience told me she already sensed something was wrong. While I was buckling her into her car seat, her eyes were already starting to close. It was late, and she was exhausted. The road ahead was dark and almost empty. Headlights swept across her small face and reflected in the rearview mirror as I drove. Her breathing became steady and even, and she was fast asleep by the time I turned onto my parents' street. I parked in their driveway, close enough to see her through the window. She was sleeping peacefully, clutching her rabbit. I locked the car doors, checked them twice, and walked up to the porch. From there I could still see her through the glass. The yard was crowded with vehicles, and a contractor's van sat parked at the curb. Light was shining from the kitchen window. When I walked inside, the smell hit me immediately: sawdust, fresh paint, something chemical, and something else I could only describe as smug satisfaction. My mother turned from the counter with a mug in her hand and her hair pinned up. She said I had scared her and asked why I had not called first. My father was showing something on his phone to a contractor, and my sister Ruth leaned against the refrigerator while scrolling through her phone. Everyone in that kitchen looked pleased with themselves, busy with their own lives, and absolutely prosperous. I told them about the card being declined at the hospital. I told them about the money that had vanished from my account. My father frowned and muttered something about banks being a complete joke. My mother just sighed and said I always took everything too personally. Ruth did not even bother looking up from her phone. I took a breath and told them I needed $25,000. I explained that I could cover $10,000 from my credit cards, but I needed $15,000 right away, by morning, before the bank could finish investigating and maybe reverse the transactions. They exchanged a quick glance, just a brief look between them, and it sent a chill straight through me. My mother said they did not have anything left to give. She waved her hand toward the gleaming, half-finished cabinets and said all their money was tied up in the kitchen renovation. I stared at them and pointed out that they had only started working on it that very day. My father replied that they had been planning this renovation for years. I repeated the word years quietly, even though I knew it was a lie. Then the comments started coming, quiet at first, but sharp as broken glass. My mother said that $70,000 was an enormous amount of money to simply throw away with no guarantee of success. She suggested that if the surgery were truly urgent, insurance would cover it. Maybe, she said, it was a sign from the universe. If my daughter was meant to live, she would live. They spoke as if they were offering me comfort, sharing their deep wisdom with someone too emotional to see clearly. I felt my jaw tighten and told them she was only 6 years old. Ruth sighed dramatically and accused me of always turning everything into a drama. She said people live with serious illnesses their entire lives. I looked at her then and noticed a new gold bracelet glinting on her wrist. For a moment I thought the smell of fresh paint was making me hallucinate. I told them I was not asking for charity, only a loan that I would repay within a week. My mother set her mug down firmly and repeated that they could not help. Every dollar was already allocated to tile, paint, and the contractor. I nodded because I had run out of words. I walked back outside into the air that smelled like dust and damp grass. From the porch I could still see Ivy asleep in the car, the streetlight reflecting softly off the window. I stood there for a moment making sure she was all right, then walked back down the path while the sound of a saw from inside the house drowned out everything else. My hands would not stop shaking. I opened the banking application again and scrolled through the list of transfers. At first, I did not pay attention to the times, only to the repeating pattern. The same amounts at even intervals, as if someone had carefully planned every single transaction in advance. Then I noticed the timestamps. Late at night, well after midnight. Every single transfer had occurred on those nights when Ivy and I had been sleeping in my parents' guest room. The realization struck me in the chest like a physical blow, knocking all the air from my lungs. The world around me narrowed and became painfully bright at the edges. It had all happened right here in this house while we slept under their roof. The light from my phone screen tinted my palms an eerie green. From the kitchen behind me I could hear laughter, light and genuine, my mother's laugh floating through the windows. I stared at the phone and everything clicked into place like a clear picture finally coming into focus. The missing money. The new kitchen cabinets. The timing that matched perfectly. One single thought cut through all the noise in my head. It was them. And then almost immediately a second thought followed. No, it could not be them. I wanted to believe that second thought. I needed to believe it with everything I had left. I looked toward the car where Ivy slept, her tiny shoes visible in the back seat and her face softly illuminated by the dashboard lights. I started the engine and drove home in complete silence, clinging to that second thought like a drowning person clings to a lifeline. There are moments in life when you can feel the story turning against you, as if some invisible narrator has turned the page without asking for your permission. I used to believe that families fell apart suddenly, in one dramatic moment. It turns out they break piece by piece over many years. My sister Ruth was born when I was 2 years old, and it feels like that was the day my parents chose their favorite child. She cried more prettily than other babies. She smiled more widely. Even her tantrums looked like carefully planned performances. My mother said Ruth simply had a gift. My father called her his little spark. And me? I was the helper, the one who made things easier for everyone. If Ruth was the beautiful painting hanging on the wall, I was simply the frame that held it in place. By the time I reached high school, I had perfected the art of being invisible. I earned good grades and created zero drama. If my parents forgot to pick me up after school, I simply waited without complaining, calmly, until they remembered. That kind of patience becomes a habit over time. It becomes the muscle memory of someone who has learned that no one is going to notice them anyway. Adulthood did not change anything. Ruth stayed at home, flitting from one vague project to another, while my mother called it an entrepreneurial spirit. I called it unemployment, but only inside my own head. I worked steady jobs, paid my bills on time, and grew accustomed to frozen dinners eaten alone. My parents did not notice, and why would they? Their favorite daughter was still there beside them, shining brightly and giving their gray, faded lives some sense of meaning. Then I met the man who would become Ivy's father. He was not the worst mistake I ever made, but he definitely ranked in the top 3. He was charming and witty, but chronically irresponsible, the kind of man who talks as if he is building a magnificent future while acting as if he is on permanent vacation from responsibility. When I became pregnant, he vanished with the skill of a professional magician. My mother told me I could still fix the situation. My father warned me not to ruin my life. Ruth said nothing at all, just smiled the way people smile when they are watching the slowest train wreck in all of history. I did not fix anything. I had my baby girl and named her Ivy. She was tiny and red-faced, furious at the entire world from her very first breath, and she was the first person who ever looked at me as if I were truly enough. And then came the medical charts with their terrible words, heart, lungs, conditions I could not pronounce, and numbers that sounded like a countdown ticking towards 0. Hospitals became our second home, as familiar to us as our own apartment. My parents visited exactly once. They brought flowers they had picked up from a gas station and a long lecture about how love alone does not pay the bills. I thanked them politely, though I did not mean it at all. For years after that, Ivy and I lived our lives between doctors' offices and sterile waiting rooms. I moved from balancing spreadsheets at work to sitting in uncomfortable hospital chairs, from ordinary days to watching over 4 drips. I learned to fake calmness so well that I almost believed it myself sometimes. I learned to smile and nod and sign consent forms, and then later I learned to cry alone in the parking lot where no one could see me. I became very good at all of it. Practice really does make perfect, even at hiding your own despair. Then 1 month ago, a doctor with kind eyes used a word I had never heard applied to my daughter before. Not manageable, not controllable, not stable for the long term, but curable. There was a new surgery available, still experimental and extremely expensive, but full of promise. Insurance companies threw their hands up and refused to cover it. The bill came to $70,000. My bank balance was a cruel joke in comparison. So I did what I have always done when things get difficult. I worked even harder. I refinanced my small house, sold my car, and cashed out every penny of my retirement savings. After all, I do not need to save for some distant future if my daughter does not get a chance to have a future at all. When the very last transfer finally went through, I stared at the numbers in my banking application for a long time. $68,000. And then I burst into tears, sobbing so hard that the screen blurred in front of my eyes. I was not crying because of the money. I was crying because for the first time in all these years of fighting, survival was not just a desperate dream anymore. It was an actual possibility. The very next day, the surgeon called to tell me they had found an opening in their schedule for the following week. I said yes before he could even finish his sentence. For 3 nights in a row after that phone call, I slept peacefully for the first time in years. Then we packed our bags and drove to my parents' house because my mother had called and said they wanted to see Ivy before her big day. Foolishly, I believed it was genuine concern. When we arrived, everything felt too cheerful, almost artificial. The smiles were too wide and the voices too bright. My mother hugged Ivy as if she were competing for some imaginary Best Grandma award. My father asked detailed questions about the cost of the surgery, and my sister Ruth called it an investment in hope. The phrase sounded like something printed on an overpriced scented candle. Jacob, my sister's boyfriend, did not bother looking up from his phone screen. He casually remarked that I could have doubled that money if I had invested in cryptocurrency instead. I smiled tightly and said nothing. Dinner that night was takeout food arranged on plates to look homemade. The conversation was polite and superficial and exhausting, just like always. When Ivy started yawning, I announced that we would go to bed early. The guest room smelled like lemon cleaning products and someone else's idea of comfort. Before going to sleep, I left my phone charging on the kitchen counter. Jacob was still sitting there alone, illuminated by the blue glow of his screen. I asked if he was working late, and he smiled and said something like that. I woke up around 1 o'clock in the morning to the sound of muffled voices and quiet laughter, with a thin line of light visible under the guest room door. I was far too tired to think anything of it and told myself it was nothing important. In the morning, my mother made pancakes for everyone, and everybody acted completely normal. My phone was sitting in the same spot where I had left it. Almost the same spot. It had been moved slightly, just an inch or two. I did not think anything of it at the time. Why would I? If someone had told me back then that betrayal has a particular sound, I would have imagined something loud like thunder. But it turns out betrayal sounds much quieter than that. It sounds like the simple click of a car door closing. When you do not know where to go next, you just drive. I drove away from my parents' house on autopilot with no clear destination in mind. Ivy was asleep in the back seat, her stuffed rabbit fallen against the window. I stared at the road ahead as if it were the only straight line remaining in my entire life. It had to be them who took the money. I knew it with certainty, but my brain was still trying desperately to protect me from that knowledge. Maybe it was a hacker, I told myself. Maybe it was some kind of system glitch. And then the obvious answer hit me like a slap: my phone. I had left it charging in their kitchen overnight. My password was 6 simple digits, Ivy's birthday, the same code I used for everything. Who can possibly remember a dozen different passwords when every single day you are busy balancing medical bills and watching oxygen saturation levels? They did not even need to be particularly smart to figure it out. They only needed to be curious enough to try. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and said out loud to no one, "Bravo, Lydia." Sarcasm was the only language I still spoke fluently at that point. I called my friend Tara before I could change my mind and talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring, and the moment I said her name, she knew something was terribly wrong. I told her everything: the missing money, the surgery deadline, my parents, all of it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then she told me to bring Ivy to her house. She said I could not drag a 6-year-old around police stations and that she would watch her for a while. I wanted to argue and refuse the help, but the words got stuck somewhere between my throat and my heart. I could only whisper thank you. Tara's house was only 10 minutes away, small and cozy, and always smelling like vanilla and fresh laundry. It was proof that someone in this world still knew how to keep their life together. She opened the door before I could even knock. One look at us and she immediately bent down to hug Ivy, asking if she was tired. Ivy nodded silently, clutching her rabbit. Tara told her that she and Mr. Rabbit would stay and have a little adventure while Mom went out to do some superhero work. I smiled weakly and said it would only be for a little while. Ivy nodded again without complaining. She was so much braver than I ever was. Tara squeezed my shoulder hard and simply said, "Go." The police station felt drowsy and tired, as if the building itself could barely stay awake. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a sound that suggested they were exhausted from simply existing. The officer sitting at the front desk looked about 12 years old, though his name badge clearly read Officer Hernandez. His expression told me he had seen worse things than this, probably much worse. I laid everything out for him in plain words: $68,000 completely gone, drained through dozens of small transfers over several days. He typed steadily without interrupting me, and the clicking of his keyboard measured out the last remaining seconds of my composure. When I finally stopped talking, he asked if I suspected anyone specific. I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again, then forced the words out. I told him I suspected my parents. Probably them. He nodded calmly, as if that was not even the strangest thing he had heard all week. He asked if anyone else could have known my phone password, and I admitted it was my daughter's birthday, 6 digits that everyone in my family knew. Everyone who mattered, I added more quietly. He did not lecture me about security or poor choices. He just kept typing, and somehow that made everything worse. Eventually, he printed out several forms and handed them across the counter with my new case number. He explained that the Financial Crimes Unit would contact me once they obtained the transfer data from the bank. He advised me to keep my phone nearby at all times. The irony of that advice was not lost on me, considering my phone was the reason any of this had happened in the first place. I walked out of the station folding the papers carefully and putting them into my pocket as if they were proof that I had not imagined the whole thing. On the drive back, I called the bank's fraud line again. The same hold music played, and the same polite voice answered, but this time the outcome was different. I gave them the police report number, and they immediately froze my account. They told me an investigator would trace the transfers and that there was a chance I could recover at least some of the money. The operator added that this would take time. That phrase seemed to be the official motto of my entire existence. After hanging up, my hands shook so badly that I could not continue driving. I pulled into a supermarket parking lot, left the engine running, and opened my laptop on the passenger seat. There is a special kind of humiliation that comes from asking a computer algorithm for help. I filled out online loan applications, microcredit forms, and credit card requests as if they were prayers I was sending out into the void. The answers came back just as reliably: denied, denied, under review, which in corporate language meant exactly the same thing. I checked the available credit on my cards and calculated carefully. If I bled every last cent dry and pretended the word interest did not exist, I could scrape together $10,000 at most. I had 10, but I needed 15. My head pounded painfully, and my hands would not stop trembling. Somewhere behind my car in the parking lot, a shopping cart rolled into another vehicle with a loud bang, and I jumped in my seat as if I had heard gunfire. I drove to Tara's house because there was literally nowhere else left for me to go. A warm light glowed from her porch, and through the front window I could see Ivy sitting on the carpet, building a crooked tower of colorful blocks while Tara pretended to read a magazine nearby. When I knocked, Tara opened the door with her phone already in her hand. She asked if there was any news, and I shook my head silently. I told her I had managed to get 10,000 together, the absolute maximum, but I was still short by 15. Tara was quiet for only a couple of seconds. Then she opened her banking application, tapped the screen a few times, and looked up at me with a simple word: done. I asked her what she had done, and she said she had transferred $15,000 for Ivy. When I started to argue, she cut me off firmly and told me not to bother. She said I could pay her back when the bank sorted everything out, and if they did not, then it would not matter anyway. I stared at her face, half relieved and half on the verge of collapsing into tears. I told her she had not even stopped to think about it. She smirked and said she had thought about it, and it had taken her exactly 3 taps on her phone. I laughed then, a raspy and painful sound that hurt coming out. I called her crazy, and she shrugged and said probably, then told me to go home. Ivy looked up from her block tower with sleepy, heavy eyes and asked if we were going home now. I told her yes, baby, we were going home. At home I put her straight to bed, and she was asleep before I could even straighten the blanket over her small body. I sat down at the kitchen table, opened my banking application once more, and waited. After a few minutes, a notification flashed across the screen: incoming transfer of $15,000. I stared at the numbers for several long seconds without moving. Then I laughed again, quietly and shakily, a laugh that seemed to seep out through my ribs instead of coming from my throat. $68,000 stolen, $25,000 salvaged, and a little girl still breathing peacefully in the next room. That night I decided to call it a draw. At 8:30 the next morning, I was sitting in the clinic parking lot, gripping the steering wheel as if it were a life raft keeping me from drowning. My account balance showed exactly $25,000, 10 scraped from my own cards and 15 from Tara. Every single time I looked at that number, I half expected it to simply vanish from the screen. The glass doors slid open automatically when I walked inside, and there was the same administrator with the same bright smile. She probably assumed I had simply needed time to transfer money between my own accounts. She greeted me cheerfully and asked if I was ready to make the deposit. Ready. What a strange and complicated word that was. I handed over my card, and the terminal blinked once, hesitated for a terrible moment, and then beeped its short digital confirmation. Approved. Paid. Done. It was such a tiny sound, but it nearly made me cry right there in the lobby. The administrator printed a receipt and congratulated me, confirming that my daughter's surgery slot was now secured for Tuesday. She looked genuinely happy for me, and for a moment I actually envied her simple, uncomplicated life. Outside, I sat down on the cold concrete curb and let the chill seep under my jacket until my body finally stopped shaking. I told myself I should feel relief flooding through me, but instead I only felt as if I were borrowing time that did not truly belong to me. On the drive home, my phone rang, and my mother's name appeared on the screen. I should have ignored the call, but old habits refuse to die easily. They die slowly and with far too much noise. When I answered, she did not waste a single second on greetings or pleasantries. She demanded to know how I could possibly have called the police on my own family. No introduction, no guilt, just pure undiluted rage in her voice. I laughed at that, which was probably not the most helpful reaction. I told her I had not called the police on them specifically, I had simply reported a crime. She called me impossible and asked if this was how I repaid them after everything they had done for me. I pointed out that what they had done was steal the money for my daughter's life-saving surgery, so thank you very much for that. She snapped that this was completely absurd and insisted they did not have my money. In the background, I heard my father's voice shouting that I was destroying the family over my medical nonsense. Medical nonsense. I nearly laughed again at those words. I shouted back that it was life-saving surgery for Ivy, not nonsense. He muttered something about me exaggerating everything as usual. My mother came back on the line and told me I was throwing money at that child as if she were a wishing well. Maybe, she suggested, it was a sign that it was time to stop. The universe was trying to tell me something. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted metal in my mouth. Then I told her that maybe she was right. Maybe it really was a sign. There was a confused pause on the other end, and she asked what kind of sign. I told her it was a sign that I should never speak to any of them again. I hung up the phone before she could find something even worse to say. For a few seconds, the car was completely silent except for my own breathing and the voice of an actor from the audiobook Ivy was listening to in the back seat. I turned the volume up as loud as it would go, just to stop hearing my own thoughts for a while. 3 days later, the police called again. It was not the young officer who had taken my initial statement this time, but a detective with a flat and professional tone. He said they had traced most of the transfers and asked if I could come into the station. In movies, those words always sound so calm and routine. In real life, it feels like something invisible is squeezing your throat and making it hard to breathe. At the station, he placed a sheet of paper in front of me covered with lines and numbers that I could not understand. The only thing I could make out clearly was one name, or rather one username, ShadowRV89. He explained that almost all the money had gone there and asked if that name meant anything to me. It meant Jacob, my sister's boyfriend, the crypto enthusiast, the one who had sat across from me at that fake cheerful dinner smiling while my daughter fell asleep only 10 feet away. I stared at the printout for a long moment and then told the detective it was him. He nodded slowly as if he had already expected that answer. He said they would take it from there, and those words sounded far too polite for what I wanted. I wanted to hear something that sounded like the click of handcuffs closing. I walked out to the parking lot and sat in my car with the engine off, my hands still shaking against the steering wheel. Betrayal did not even surprise me anymore. It had stopped being a shock and had become something else entirely, something heavy and permanent that settled deep inside me like dust that you eventually stop trying to wipe away. 2 days later, the detective called again. He told me they had obtained a warrant and requested data from the cryptocurrency exchange where the money had been sent. The account absolutely belonged to Jacob, confirmed by his email address and a photograph of his identification. Half of the stolen money had already been converted back into regular dollars and transferred directly to my parents' bank account. The kitchen renovation, the contractor, the timing of everything, it all lined up like dominoes falling one after another in slow, inevitable motion. The detective said they had them now, and my own name sounded foreign and distant when he spoke it. I hung up the phone and sat for a very long time just staring into empty space without really seeing anything. The next morning, the bank called. They had confirmed the police report and approved a temporary credit to my account. The representative explained that the funds would be available while the investigation continued, and I did not bother asking what exactly temporary meant in this situation. Temporary was enough for me. That same evening, I made the first deposit payment for Ivy's pre-surgical procedures. The amount listed on the bill looked more like a telephone number than a sum of money, but at least my account balance was no longer sitting at zero. When Ivy finally fell asleep that night, I stood in her bedroom doorway just watching her breathe. The room smelled softly like lavender shampoo and the sweet syrup that had spilled on her pillow during breakfast that morning. Her small chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Her stuffed rabbit was tucked securely under her chin the way she always held it. For the first time in many weeks, I looked at my daughter without numbers and diagnoses and survival statistics running obsessively through my head. I was supposed to feel victorious in that moment, but instead all I felt was silence. It was the kind of silence that arrives after a powerful storm passes through, too fragile to trust and too still to feel entirely real. The apartment looked exactly the same as it always had, but something fundamental inside me had shifted and changed forever. The money was back, at least enough to keep moving forward. The police were handling everything else now. My parents could keep their beautiful new kitchen if they wanted it. I turned off the light in the hallway and leaned back against the wall, letting the silence fill up all the empty space around me. This time the silence was all I had left, silence and the simple promise that morning would come again. And for the first time in my entire life, that was actually enough. 2 years later, Ivy's lungs sound like music to my ears. There is no more wheezing, no more monitors beeping in the night, no more middle-of-the-night panics and rushed drives to emergency rooms. Just regular breathing, light and peaceful and absolutely perfect. Now she runs through the park instead of hospital corridors, and every single laugh that escapes her small body feels like the world is finally paying me back with interest for everything I endured. The investigation wrapped up completely the same year that Ivy had her surgery. My parents and my sister Ruth all pleaded guilty to grand larceny and fraud charges. They received 6 months in county jail, 3 years of probation, and an order for full restitution of every penny they had stolen. Jacob took a plea deal as an accessory after the fact, admitting that he had helped them move the money because he was convinced cryptocurrency transactions were completely invisible and untraceable. It turned out he was very wrong about that. At one of the court hearings, Jacob claimed he had believed the transfers were properly authorized and that he was only trying to help family with their finances. My mother sat in the courtroom and made excuses, repeating the same phrase she had used with me. They really needed the money. Listening to all of them together, their justifications almost sounded charitable in some twisted way. The judge did not believe a single word of it. They were forced to sell their house to pay back every last cent they owed. Restitution, legal fees, court costs, and that beautiful kitchen renovation they had been so proud of, all of it was gone forever. They ended up with criminal records and each other. I ended up with something far more valuable: peace. I have not spoken to any of them since that day. No phone calls, no messages, no fake apologies arriving years too late. Just silence stretching on and on, the best inheritance anyone could ever give me. Ivy is healthy and strong and full of life. I am afloat and moving forward. And for the first time in a very long time, we are both breathing easy. So tell me honestly, do you think I went too far in the end, or maybe not quite far enough? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe for more stories like this one.